The wind that rose from the pyre carried the smell of burned horsehair and cedar and old secrets up into the night. Sparks drifted like strange, bright moths. Dawn came as if on tiptoe, washing the flats of parched earth in a gray that was almost tender. When the last log settled with a soft sigh and the smoke thinned to a wan ribbon, the world felt remade, scarred and hollowed and impossibly new. Daenerys stood where heat had turned the ground to glass. Ash clung to her skin in fine whirls, catching the light on her arms and ribs. At her feet, 3 creatures threaded themselves about her ankles as if she were a hill with sun on it and they were shadows learning how to belong. Their scales were small as coins, their necks thin as whips, their eyes little coals. They were hungry and she was mother, and the truth of both could not be parted. "Khaleesi," Ser Jorah said. He spoke carefully, a man stepping across ice not yet sure of its thickness. He looked older by that light, the slate of his beard silvered, his cheeks caved in toward his teeth. "We must move." Irri and Drogo were already busy in the pallid morning, hauling waterskins that tasted of leather and old meat, gathering the last of the withered figs they had not thought to save for anything but the dead. The remaining Dothraki, if they were still a Khalasar, watched with the long, dazed faces of men who had seen the world change while they slept. Ricardo knelt between 2 of the dead horses, cradling nothing, without language for his loss. Jiki whispered to the dragons in the language of childhood, the way one whispers to the sea, as if both might turn kind. Daenerys stooped. One of the dragonlings, black, with smoke shadows threaded through his wings, faced her boldly, jaws parted. Fire lived at the root of him like a secret that made him shake. "Drogon," she said, and he claimed the name, a soft unfurling of neck and a hiss that was almost pleased. The green one came to her touch with a soft trill regal, and the cream and gold crouched in the shadow of her foot Viserion, his tongue tasting the hot ash. "We go to the sea," Daenerys said. The words sounded unassailable, as if they belonged to the morning and not to her. Not east into emptiness, not to die of thirst and the generosity of carrion crows. The sea is where men go when they need roads that do not remind them of their failures. "The sea is far," Ser Jorah said. "Everything is far." She looked at the horizon. The red waste lay as if a great red beast had lain down to sleep and never woke. "Then we will be far from here quickly." Jorah's gaze went from her bare head to the dragons clinging like brooches to her shoulders. He nodded, small, as if an argument had moved in him and then left, wanting air. "There are caravan roads," he said. "We can sell the last of the gold for skins and grain and hire guides who never lose the old wells. From the wells, the desert gives way to the trade roads that bend toward Qarth." "Qarth," she said, tasting the name that had lived as rumor in the tents of her call. "And from Qarth, ships." "Ships," he allowed, "or more courtship than you have patience for." Daenerys's mouth tugged at one corner. "I have patience for little but water and wind and the taste of salt on my lips." Her handmaids wrapped her in a pale dress that had been meant for a different dawn. The dragons clung where they wished. They had no patience at all and every hunger. They walked when the heat was still kind, and when it grew cruel, they walked anyway. Where the desert lay unbroken, they learned to recognize the way stones could lie so that water had once tried to rest there, and how the thinnest brush might shiver when a wind blew from underground. They ate dates so dry they were more memory than fruit, and the meat of goats whose eyes had made them all turn their faces once. The dragons took instruction as if it were a game. The black would dart at a thrown scrap and drag it away. The green learned to lift on the wind with a lizard's bright curiosity. The pale one slept tangles of sleep and then woke with a need that made him tremble until he fed. She sang to them. Sometimes she did not know if the song was for them or for the part of herself that did not yet have a name. They found a caravan road at the broken feet of old stone men who had been statues before time. A Qarthine caravan crossed their path with the nonchalance of boats passing far out on the same sea. Silk chests like small temples, rhinos with painted horns, men whose smiles were a kind of currency. They moved around Daenerys's ragged group and would have left them to the honesty of thirst until Drogon's sudden gout of flame drew all eyes into one shape. The caravan master squinted, as if he could decide what the world actually was by making the right face at it. He was a man of rings and thin fingers, his robe the color of old roses. He stared at the dragon clinging to Daenerys' shoulder until it stared back, and then he lowered his gaze, which was as much a bow as a man who sold the world and bought it again might allow. "Mother of something," he said in a tongue like oil and music. "Will you walk to Karth and make us all ashamed that we once measured value without you?" "Your wells," Daenerys said, before he could wrap the air in lace. "Your shade, your road, and you will pay with?" His mouth quirked, amused at the etiquette that required asking even when the answer wanted no arithmetic. "I will arrive," she said. The dragons burned meat under his awnings, and children with bangles on their ankles came as if the heat were a festival. That night Daenerys dreamed of a city with gates like the sun and shadows that spoke. In the dream, the black dragon flew above her, and when he beat his wings, the air became a kind of road. They reached Karth with sand in every seam of them. The city rose from the edge of a vanished ocean as if it had invented the idea of water and then spent a long time tasting itself. The gates gleamed like the sides of a pearl pried open. The 13 came to greet her in perfumed masks and light robes and words that meant gifts but wanted debts. Xaro Zoandaxos held out his hands as if he could cradle both her and whatever she might do to his city at once. "Daenerys of the he said, the laugh gold and practiced. "Daenerys, I am so glad to live at the same time as you. You smell of cardamom," she said, which made him tilt his head like a cat attending a poem. Every hospitality in Karth was a promise tied to a string. Every cup of water came with a compliment that had poison for a brother and a lover. They feasted her in courtyards where the leaves themselves appeared to be enriched, and where men of commerce made conversation as if they were laying siege. Piet Pri, a warlock with a voice like a door being shut, invited her to see the heart of their house. Kaith came veiled in lacquered stars and said nothing that did not sound like an echo from under a mountain. "At our tables you shall find the sea swaying in its bowl," Xaro told her. "At our temples the gods admit they might be yours. At our docks, ships are like teeth in a mouth that eats distance. Accept what is owed to wonder. 3 galleys, swift as wives who knew your name before they were born. A stake in a dozen caravans. A pearl the weight of certainty. One small thing in return." "What?" "Stay," he said, with a candor that was almost honest. "Let Karth be the city that adopts a miracle and teaches it to spend." Daenerys looked toward the water, which had the color of old glass by late light. "I remember being sold once," she said. "I remember the weight of a city clasping me like a ring. I do not care to be owned by anyone's astonishment." He smiled without teeth. "Then take the ships and go make enemies that will keep you warm. I will be offended, but only in a way that aids my digestion." Kaith found her at dusk, on a balcony where the heat rose like an animal learning how to purr. "All around you are nets," the woman in the lacquered mask said. "Some are woven from silk, some from shadows. Look west and see a mask painted with a smile whose teeth are knives." "I will look west," Daenerys said, "and then I will go." "You are fire," Kaith said. "Be careful when men offer to keep you safe." The dragons grew in the weeks it took to find courage in navigators' eyes. They learned to rise from her wrists to the balustrade with a flare of membrane, to skim and swerve. When the first ship eased out of the jade gates between tall towers carved with swans, Drogon wrapped his body like a chain about her shoulders and hissed at the way water undid land. The oars took the day apart, one long stroke at a time. They sailed with only the crew's grudging gods and wind that couldn't decide if it loved or disliked them. The sea taught the dragons other lessons: how to follow flying fish and not be offended when their prey chose air and bright death; how to hang almost still above a whitecap and then drop a black knife. Daenerys learned to find a kind of silence in the drum of oars, to read weather from the color of the horizon and the taste of it. On nights when water and sky conspired to look alike, she lay awake and imagined Westeros like a story she had only heard secondhand and never dared ask to hold. Volantis rose from the river's mouth like a grand old woman whose paint could not disguise the set of her bones. They moored where the smell of the water turned sweet and then bitter with rot. The Red Temple's fires were tall and theatrical, banners of flame that made men fling their arms out as if they were themselves offering. A high priest with a voice like wine said words about rebirth and ash and swords drawn from hearts as if naming things could make them hers. Daenerys' acolytes lit braziers as if they were kindling suns. "You are more than sign," one whispered, the glow making his eyes bottomless. "You are the point of it." "I am a woman who has lost nearly everything," Daenerys said. Drogon cocked his head at the smoke, a dark king regarding a junior element. "If your fires can keep my people from starving, then your god is welcome to walk beside us." The widow of the waterfront stood in her balcony like a minor goddess of trade who had misplaced her temple. She sent wine and a pair of sleek rivercraft and a boy with eyes like the river itself. "Everything sweet rots," she sent word. "Eat it while it is still sweet. When Volantis smiles, count your spoons." They did not linger. The dragons disliked the city's stones. They tasted of old blood, of chains warmed by sun. Daenerys paid with the pearl Zaro had wanted to name and with promises she meant to keep until they broke. On the last night, as the river washed its hands of them and the sea again spread itself like a map rolled flat, a woman stood at the end of the quay veiled in lacquered stars. Daenerys did not wave. The constellations do not wave. They burn and vanish and leave you to decide what you saw. Pentos greeted them with indifference gilded by caution. Illyrio sent a feast ahead of him so that by the time he arrived, his food had already argued for him. He waddled into the chamber like a boat making decisions about a closed harbor, perfumes preceding him like pets. He took Daenerys' hands and said her name as if it were his. "My sweet child," he murmured. "You are a wine I had begun to think I would never taste. You are home and also a map to where home might have been." "Do you have ships," she asked, "that are not gossip? Do you have friends who do not intend to spend me?" He patted her knuckles, which told her he thought of her as both daughter and coin. "I have ships," he said, "and friends, and I have patience. The world opens to those who let it. Wait a little, sweetling. There is a storm of kings in Westeros. Joffrey sits as if the chair is his by measure. Renly plays at pageantry and makes a game of oaths. Stannis is iron without warm blood. Robb Stark is a pup with a crown forced onto his head. You are a song. It would be a pity to sing you into the noise." "Songs are not afraid of noise," Daenerys said. "A road of water runs from here to Westeros. I will take it." Illyrio's smile discovered gravity. "I have a prince," he said, as if mentioning a dessert he kept under a cloth in the kitchen to be revealed at the perfect time. "I am not a pastry," Daenerys said, "and I am not anyone's second course." He blinked once, slowly. "No," he admitted, "you are not." Still, he sent letters, sealed in fat and secrecy, to places where men counted power in nephews and ships in other men's hands. One went south and west across the summer blue to Sunspear and Prince Doran Martell, who had the patience of a rock that remembered it had been a mountain once. Another went to Lys, where men rented out their loyalty the way others rented out rooms with pleasant light. Another, Daenerys suspected, went nowhere at all and was intended to be found. The answer from Dorne was written in a hand careful enough to be worried for its own immortality. Spoke simply, "The blood of the dragon has always found water in Dorne. Bring your thirst, bring your children, bring your claim. We will bring shade." She sailed with a Lyseni captain who had learned from weather the art of looking unimpressed even when surprised. Dragons do not look unimpressed. They inspected gulls and threw their shadows across the decks like new laws. Salt laid itself on everything as if it had been waiting for her all along. Sunspear rose like heat that had grown a mind. The water gardens breathed greenly in the middle distance. Pools turned to mirrors, children's laughter making daytime seem as reliable as a map. Prince Doran received her in a chamber where the shutters made thin, civilized shadows on the floor. He was a heavy man who made stillness look like a talent, and he watched her with the kind of attention that made lies come apart of their own accord. "My mother told me stories of your family's dragons," he said. "They lowered the sky. They made the sun remember it had obligations to the earth. They were my ancestors' children," Daenerys said, and did not hide how that part of the sentence hurt. "These are mine." He looked at Drogon until Drogon looked back and then lowered his eyes, like the caravan master had done. Some acknowledgments traveled better than others. "We have not forgotten," Doran said. "We remember Elia and her babes. We remember ravens that brought nothing we could live with. We remember that Aegon the Conqueror had weepers among his admirers, and that some tears were not flattery. We do not love the Lannisters. We do not love winter. We do not love the way the world treats those who do not rush to put their throats under some man's heel. But I do not rush. My enemies rush," Daenerys said quietly, "and their rush is called counsel, and the whisper of it is called policy." Doran's mouth twitched. "You will like my brother better," he said. "He rushes in straight lines and writes poetry after." Prince Oberyn came in with sunlight running up his spear like an old friend. He kissed her hand as if he had invented the ritual and laughed when Drogon nipped at the air between them. Arianne Martell stood behind her father's chair, hair like midnight learning how to be astonished without showing it. She watched Daenerys with the curiosity of a woman who had met beauty on its own terms and wanted a conversation with it. "Will you let us keep you?" Oberyn asked. "Like a knife we promised not to use?" "I have already been a knife in someone else's hand," Daenerys said. "It did not go well. We could offer you something different than a hand," Arianne said, as if she meant a home and not a trap. "We could offer a place to stand while the war tilts. Our spears, our patience." "Your patience is a kind of spear," Daenerys said. They spoke for an hour and another. Words drifted across the surface of peril like lily pads that hid deep water and creatures that had no need to breathe. Quentyn Martell entered once, earnest and immediately uncomfortable for having done so. He bowed and looked at the dragons with hope and to Daenerys with a hope of a different temperature, which she found herself pitying. When they offered her the water gardens and a chamber whose shutters could make hills out of sunlight, she accepted because shade is not always a bribe. Children swam and splashed and shouted. Drogon sat on the lip of a pool and made steam of the water with his breath until a little boy clapped, who did not yet know he had seen the future reduce the present to wonder. "Dragonstone," she said to Ser Jorah that evening, drawing the word with a wet finger on the table between them. "It is ours by right and will be ours by fact. Stannis Baratheon holds it now," Jorah said. "He is not a man who confuses his wants with his rights. Then he will know why I come," she said, "and he will have the chance to bow and keep his head." "You mean to strike at once," he said, unhappily admiring. "You mean to set your foot on the rock of your house and make of that foot a statement." She smiled a little. "You are fond of statements that are swords. You will have one. I am not content to let men in antlered helms and foxbright cloaks decide who sits me out of history. I will sit where my blood sat. I will look at the painted table and not as a story in a book." They sailed under a sky that had decided to forgive itself for being as blue as it was. Doran gave them ships and men who knew the tricky courtesies of shoals. Oberyn gave them laughter and a basket of pomegranates that bled on the deck. Arianne gave Daenerys a ring, gold worked in a pattern that did not quite resolve, and a look that said negotiations can be affection if you let them. Before they cast off, a man with hair like winter straw stepped into the shade and bent one knee as if the ground suspected him of being royalty. "I am called Arstan," he said. His voice was not one you would trust to carry your secret for more than an hour. "I have served kings and would serve you if you have a place for an old man who knows where the bones are in a great many rooms." Dany studied him. He had the shoulders of a man who had once lifted more than he should. His eyes were clear, and there was something in his bow that was not subservience but a court's memory of dignity. "Ride with us," she said. "If my house has bones in it, I would know them." He came aboard with a squire named Belwas who took up space as if space were an opponent and ate as if hunger were something other people had to suffer. Dragonstone appeared from the fog like an idea that had grown tired of secrecy. The great black fortress rose from the mount's dark bones, towers shaped like dragons. Mouths flared to roar at a sea that no longer cared about terrors that had once been infinite. The smell of wet stone and old smoke made the air feel like someone else's memory pressing up against your mouth. Daenerys stood at the prow and felt an ache that began in her, and in her mother's mother, and in the rock itself. "Bring us into the cove," she said. "The fog will be our courtesy." They came at dawn when gulls had the courage of their hunger and men had only the dreams of an hour past. Her ships rode like a single creature. The oars took water and gave it back and asked nothing. The first men on the docks were still rubbing sleep from their eyes when Drogon flared his wings and the sight took their breath and their argument. The gate held a moment, because gates are made of men as much as of wood and iron. When the hinges cursed and lifted, Yora moved with men who had learned discipline. Under cruel suns, and Bell was rolled up his sleeves and laughed as if he had been invited to an intimate dinner. They made for the stone drum, for the heart that had once known the pulse of her house's rule. The corridors smelled of damp and anger. Tapestries hung like tired queens. Only when they reached the painted table chamber did Daenerys allow herself to stop. The table was as she had dreamed it. Westeros laid out in wood and paint, rivers no more than the width of a nail, mountains tamed to humps under varnish. She set her hands on it and felt something like cold move up her arms and then warmth return. "Bring the garrison," she said. "There will be men who fought and men who watched other men fight. We will treat both as dangerous." Ser Axel Florent, castellan in Stannis' absence, came sweating in a red beard like a fox's. He had the expression of a man who knows he has miscalculated and resents reality for its lack of gallantry. "By what right?" She lifted her hand. Drogon hissed, a bright needle pull of sound. "By blood," she said. "By law older than your queen's mother's tears. By might, if you prefer that language." He looked to Yora and then to Arstan and then to the bare throat of his own hands. He knelt more awkwardly than a man his age should have to learn. "Dragon," he muttered, as if the word were a cursed scene for what it truly is. "Your men will be fed and paid and kept from stupidity by discipline," Daenerys said. "Any who will swear to me will live. Any who will not and yet will lay down arms will live. Any who decide to be gallant about my hospitality will die." "So it is with queens," Florence said, and made the nod a man makes to his own survival. She slept that night in a chamber hung with sea-damp tapestries. Drogon coiled in the basket of her arms, Regal on the mantle, Viserion in the hollow of the eaves where a draft made a song only dragons could hear. Wind tried the shutters, and the castle creaked like an old horse turning over the idea of running again. At some hour between sleep and wakefulness, the air went cold in a manner that did not belong to weather. Daenerys sat up on the moan of instinct and felt the hair on her arms lift. Something moved in the corner, a thickening of shadow beyond what the candle allowed. It slid along the stone as gracefully as a finger across silk. Drogon's throat glowed, and with a soft, savage sound he exhaled a ribbon of flame. The shadow buckled as if it had been stabbed, turned back on itself in a limacone of moving dark, and then was gone, as if it had never quite been. In the morning, she found the candle was blackened, as if time had gone wrong for it for a few breaths. Arstan stood by the mantel and watched the smoke with eyes that were not old at all. "There are enemies who believe darkness can be made to do chores," he said. "They are sometimes surprised that the household has changed hands." From Dragonstone she sent ravens as if they were throwing nets, to Crownland's houses whose names looked like footnotes under the grate, to Stormlords whose pride made them generous when they thought themselves admired, to Dorne, thanks delivered in courtesy made words, to Old Town where knowledge had been taught to mistrust fire, and to the Reach where gardens had been taught to undersell their own wildness. Some letters came back with courtesies, others with silence, a few with sandstone promises that would need to be worn into shape. Tyrion Lannister read her name in the letter that reached King's Landing and felt at once older and more awake. "She means to test our capacity for panic," he told Varys, who learned panics sent the way some men learned wine. "Or sanity, whichever breaks first." "Dragons," Varys said. apologetically tasting the word as if it were a pastry too rich for common service. "Small dragons," Tyrion said, and turned the quill in his fingers. "But even small dragons adjust the room." He ordered the alchemists to work as if fear were a cup he handed them again and demanded they not spill a drop. He stood atop the walls at evening and watched the river turn the color of coins, and wished that his father had taught him how to be a different sort of clever. Stannis Baratheon, on the other hand, received the news on his march from Dragonstone with a grim science. "She has taken my seat," he told Melisandre, voice flat enough for a carpenter, "and with it a symbol. I saw darkness reach for her and be burned," Melisandre said, in the tone of a woman who finds in catastrophe a reason to be pleased. "There is a sword, my king. There is a fire. There is a dawn that belongs to a name that is not the one men currently cheer." "I do not traffic in dawns," Stannis said, but he looked into the brazier for longer than men look at flames when they only want warmth. On Dragonstone, Daenerys learned the castle's moods the way a new mother learns her infants. She walked the galleries where legend had once hung as easily as banners, and the dragons learned the staircases and the small impossibilities of a fortress built by men who had wanted the sea to feel unwelcome. The painted table absorbed her mornings, with Regal nosing the wooden hills of the Vale and Viserion clinging to the Stormlands like a pearl. She placed carpets of small metal men and changed them as letters came in dripping news. Houses Valerion and Celtigar sent envoys who spoke music about prudence and morality and, when pressed, admitted that they remembered a time when their banners had not been embarrassed by dragons. Driftmark's harbor made her smile for the first time in a while, a white crescent bitten out of the island, and Lord Montfort Valerion bent more easily than a man of his rank should have. "I always like to win," he said. "You look like winning." Ships multiplied in the bay below the Black Keep, their masts like a young forest coming up fast. Daenerys walked between the boats and counted coin with serious men who made the sound of copper turning to courage. She accepted Axel Florent's grudging counsel when it was not poisoned by his need to be right, and Arsten's when it was shaped by a memory of courts where men had not been ashamed to speak plainly. One morning, Arstan came to her with Yora in tow and a face like a sword that had remembered what cutting was for. "Your Grace," he said, which still made something warm flicker under her ribs. "There is a thing you must know." He laid it out as a butcher lays out a roast and invited the knife. Yora's letters to a spider in a city that pretended it never did anything by halves. The sale of news about her a girl ago. Stolen letters from Illyrio's desk and others found. The coin that traveled without shame. "I did it long before you were what you are. And then I kept doing it out of cowardice and foolish hope," Yora said in a voice that had gone hoarse the way a man's voice goes hoarse when his throat has decided it can't stand itself. "I love you," he added, "because men bring that word to a burning house as if it were water." Daenerys listened and did not move. The dragons canted their heads at the sound of their names in voices not theirs. Her face felt like armor she had not known she'd put on. "You loved me and sold me all the same," she said finally. "You loved me and made of me a market. And because mercy is a thing that is not always soft," she said, "go. Leave this island now. If you are here at sundown, I will make ashes of your explanation." Arstan watched him go with the sorrow of a man who has known many kings and learned what men will do to serve them and themselves. Later, when the sun had set, he bowed in the candlelight with a grace that made the room look better just by being repeated. "My name is Barristan Selmy," he said. "I failed your father. I served a usurper, and I intend to die well in your service." The name landed in her like the sudden arrival of a certainty. "Then rise, Ser Barristan," she said, because that was her right, and because the room had been needing to hear it for more years than it had walls. The summer made itself less convinced. Letters came with worse manners. A raven from the Riverlands spoke in a tight, neat hand of a young wolf with men's admiration on his brow and with victory in his pockets that ate like a rat. Another, from King's Landing in a ruder scrawl by the time it was copied, shouted half-mad in ink about wildfire, about a green sea that burned ships as if they were indulgences, about a queen who drank and a boy king who had learned to sneer as if it were strategy. From Dorne, Prince Doran sent patience wrapped in a cloth you could not see through. When you choose to move, he wrote, you will find your footfall echoed on our roads. She chose to move. They sailed north in a fleet that looked like an argument with winter. Gale winds rose around Dragonstone and then relented, as if the island understood it had been asked to play a part it had once delighted in. In King's Landing, Tyrion lined the river with jars of green glass and prayed to every god he had not already insulted. The alchemists clucked like hens around their own miracle and made a ritual of being incompetent until suddenly they weren't. Daenerys anchored on the southern side of Blackwater Bay behind a spit of land with rocks like sleeping dogs. In the night, she listened to the city breathe. She could almost hear it thinking, fear is a language. She sent scouts in small boats and layered her fleet so that men would not be able to count what she had no need to brag about. She watched the dragons fly and return as if the world itself were a room they had finally been allowed into. Your Grace, Barristan said, pointing at a stretch of indifferent water that night, a smudge that would mean nothing to a man who had not known war's appetite. If I were Lannister cunning, I would have a surprise there, something that needs you to be bold and blind. I am bold, she said, eyes on the black water. I am not blind. She sent the first ships forward with their oars muffled and their men instructed to look humble. The city's walls bristled with brows, archers, stones. In the moonlight, the mud gate was a box's mouth. She gave the signal, hand raised, and at once the world turned green. Jars cracked with the complacency of glass that believed itself immortal. The wildfire threw up curtains, pillars, dances of impossible color. The river became a law older than water. Men screamed, would leapt as if with joy, with despair, with confession. The first wave of her ships would have died if she had not already expected men to do what they always did when afraid. Everything. Now, she said, and Drogon leapt like a thought too quick for speech. He slammed into the green the way a storm slams into a mountain. Fire hates to share a room. Drogon's black breathed into the green, and at once the flames changed, slunk low like cats offended, then peeled back, thrown into confusion. Regal and Viserion darted and dipped, wings drawing skeins in air taut with heat. The alchemists on the walls cried out to their god of petty resentments. And in the red keep Cersei Lannister put a goblet to her mouth with a hand that did not tremble because she had taught it not to. Tyrion watched with the look of a man who has counted and finds that the numbers have declared independence. So, he said to no one at all, we will learn something about the friendship between fire and fire. The fight that followed was messy, like all fights that matter. Grapnels dragged men to arguments they had not wanted to have. X-Men learned to hate chain. Oars broke, and curses rose in every known tongue. Load after load of green death failed to behave as written. Across the water, as dawn moved in with a poor man's gait, a southern banner came bright, a golden rose on green. The Tyrell fleet, the reach of Highgarden ripening where it could most insult Stannis' schedule. They moved toward the Lannister side because of the language gold speaks when it forgets it is a metal. Daenerys held. A queen who charges at dawn is a story. A queen who waits while men around her regain their courage is a fact. She did not throw her last strength at the river. When the wind shifted and smoke went east like a tired army, she signaled her ships to withdraw cleanly, a lesson men only learn after their first death. Her dragons came down to her decks scorched and triumphant and furious that victory had flavors other than meat. On the city's wall, Tyrion exhaled a breath he'd been forgetting to arrange and scratched his nose as if he could scratch the ugliness off everything. She lived, he said to Varys, who stood with his hands folded and a face that invited confidences the way baths invite sins. And she can count. That's worse for us than if she'd won a song. Songs are not as permanent as men think, Varys murmured. Dear lad, we will need to be resourceful. Dany steered her fleet back to Dragonstone with the discipline of a woman who knew how to save her own life. On the second day, a small swift ship pulled alongside with the flag of a merman with a crown atop a swordfish. Lord Valerion's messenger boarded with news that moved too quickly for paper. The Tyrells had thrown their lot with the Lannisters, A marriage had been made out of fear and mourning hunger, and Stannis had found every door in the city stuffed with excuses and then shut. Daenerys sat at the painted table, one bare foot tucked beneath her knee, Drogon a live weight over her shoulders. She looked from the miniature hammerhorn to the trident to King's Landing, where a green smudge lingered as if the painter had lost interest mid-stroke. "If a marriage is a map, we need to draw a different road," she said. "Dorne remains with you," Barristan said. "The Stormlands will follow the man who can keep their sons eating and their daughters married. The Crownlands will follow whoever comes to their doors with less arrogance than the last man." "And the North?" Daenerys asked. "The Riverlands?" "The North," Barristan said, "does not love dragons. It loves its own weather. It has made a king of a boy whose eyes are the color of iron and patience. The Riverlands will pretend to be surprised by whatever happens, as all river countries do." She slept uneasily, dreams twined, her son Rego, breathing with a strange, slow music. A hall of doors and a tower that had no interest in angles. A throne made of knives that bent like reeds in a storm when fire looked at it. She woke with the taste of snow in her mouth and wondered why that should feel like warning rather than promise. "Envoie Cam." From Dorne, Arianne again, with a shawl woven into a map of the Boneway and with arguments that looked like invitations. "Let us march," she said. "Let us take the pass and knock at Storm's End, as if we have been polite all our lives and have simply been unable to find the door." Oberyn offered to ride the princes of the march like a storm his spear had seduced. Doran's letter was a cork in the wine. "Choose your timing. Bleed them where the green is on their banners, not where the stone is in their walls. Storm's End has turnips made of stone." "Arstan, no," Barristan said. "It will open itself to you if hunger visits long enough, and if there is a traitor who loves pride more than honor at an opportune postern." "Do they all have such a traitor?" Daenerys asked. "All keeps," Barristan said gently, "have such a man. They are built into the mortar. They took the Boneway as if the mountain had been waiting to be climbed by the right insult. Dornish spears moved like water thinking about being a knife. In passes where the breath was a debt and not a song, Daenerys learned the cadence of marching with men who did not look to her for answers to hunger but to weather. She kept the dragons in the air and on her shoulders and felt their weight in her bones where bad weather feels welcome. Storm's End was a pregnant circle against a paling sky. It looked like a joke told by a man who had lost every other way of talking. "Once, onions grew brave for this castle," Barristan said as they made their first slow ring, banners unfurling in winds that did not love anyone. "I have seen a smuggler make a night of himself with nothing but bread and risk. Find me one of those," Daenerys said. "I will need both bread and risk when I sit in a city that has taught itself to hate memory." The siege was a posture as much as it was a fact. Daenerys set her camp with the justice of geometry and the mercy of latrines that did not offend. She walked every morning and let men see that she had more patience than pride, and more hunger than rhetoric. She learned the names of men who would die for stories and of those who would die only for pay, and she paid. At night she sat with Arianne and listened to Oberyn make jokes so precise they were almost laws. She watched her dragons hum to the sea with their throats. The door opened from the inside, as such doors often do. A man with a knot of discontent at his mouth and with ambition that had not found a respectable outlet showed Barristan the angle at which a key fails to be a key and becomes history. The postern gate swung. Drogon hissed and flamed, and then, because fire is not a surgeon, Dany called him back, and they moved in with the control of a hand entering a box and taking only the pebble, not the viper. A banner came down. A new one went up. Storm's End was warm with men suddenly finding themselves on the right side of caution. In the hall that had once been a promise and then a vault and now had become merely a room, Dany stood beneath the old beams and felt less like a conqueror than a woman brought into a house her grandparents had wanted her to see. "Cut the ropes on the gates," she told a captain with a face that had been bullied by weather. "Let the villagers bring their grain to trade without being haggled into famine. Send bread to the sept and do not mention my name unless they ask it 3 times. We will be loved or we will not. We will not pretend." From King's Landing came a letter sealed with Lannister wax so red it looked unwell. Cersei wrote in a hand that stabbed at the paper. Said, "Leave off your life." Said, "Come and throw your children into my fire." Said, "You are a girl with a ferret who pretends to ride a lion." Tyrion's enclosure, in a different hand entirely, said, "If there must be queens, be one who understands arithmetic." He sent a list of ships that could be bribed and men who might accept virtue as a reasonable bribe if it wore coin's perfume. "Will you write him?" Arianne asked, amusement like an ornament in her voice. "I will not," Daenerys said. "He knows his own counsel. He will know mine when it arrives in the sky." Winter sent a whisper. It was in the letter from the wall that came folded up like a piece of weather that had consented to be mail only under duress. The curl of the hand was that of an educated man who looked out over what no men had made and loved it. The words were a report and an apology. Hard rangers lost, things seen that did not belong in a world that believed in spring. It asked nothing of her. It sat under her palm quietly until Drogon laid his jaw on it and huffed, unimpressed. "There is always the north," Barristan said. "Even when you have dealt with every other direction, the north remains like a second floor no one remembers they own." She sent a gift to the wall. Bolts of Dornish wool, salted fish, a letter written in her careful hand that said she had not forgotten that men could freeze to death while queens discovered themselves. "From Daenerys of House Targaryen," she wrote at the bottom, "who would be queen of a living realm. She could not be everywhere. The world is a table too long for even the youngest arms." Theon Greyjoy took Winterfell and practiced his old talents under new banners. And in the Riverlands, men who had once sung of honor learned to sing of hunger. Robb Stark made a marriage of kindness and strategy that made kindness look like treason. He bled for it in ways that left stains on the map even a careful cloth could not remove. Even so, stories in small villages along the Rose Road began to include a woman with silver hair and small dragons who had, for reasons no one agreed upon, left their children alive during a raid, and had paid for bread instead of taking it when she could have used the excuse of war. There is no algebra for faith, yet it sometimes appears on a ledger all the same. Dany returned to King's Landing with a smaller fleet and a larger reputation. She came at dusk with clouds that made the city look as if the gods had left it under a cloth. She did not bring wildfire with her. She brought silence. Her ships slipped into the Blackwater with the stealth of momentary truce. She had men on both banks now, and she had found the patience to own patience. Under the cover of a storm that almost happened and then was embarrassed into rain, Gold Cloaks opened a gate. Varys's birds are not loyal so much as they are rational. Some men find that reason comes to them for the first time in the night. The streets smelled the way fear always smells, of old wine, of piss, of a quarter of hope. Her riders went forward softly, as if they were thieves and not a returning house. She did not let the dragons lead. She led. In the Red Keep, the Iron Throne waited with the shyness of a monster pretending to be a chair. Cersei Lannister had flown with her children to the Great September under escort, imagining sanctity would remind history of its manners. Joffrey cursed and loved the sound of his own brave mouth. Tyrion drank and counted exits. Marjorie Tyrell smiled a smile that would make a winter feel it had been too severe. Dany came into the throne room as a woman comes into a house that has heard of her and does not know whether to ask her to take off her shoes. She approached the throne and did not touch it. Drogon hissed at it, and the sound ran up the iron like a rat. The room held its breath. "Bring me the key to the city," she said to a guard whose helmet was not quite the right size for his ideas. "My lady, there isn't." He stopped because he heard himself and because he saw that he had been about to teach an ocean how to be wet. "Send word," she said, "to the September, to Maegor's Holdfast and every room with a lock in this keep. The queen has returned for her chair, and her preference is that no unjustified dead be thrown at her feet in welcome. But I am as I am. There are always unjustified dead." A maid slipped in the corridor and broke her neck on a step worn down by knees. A man panicked and stabbed his cousin because he had once described the Targaryens as a myth and feared this would be known. In the September, Cersei lifted a vial and Tyrion took it with a deftness that would have looked like magic to any man who had not seen him steal a heart or two with the same hands. He put it in his pocket and said, later sister. And Cersei did not protest because sometimes even the proud remember they had been children once. The Tyrells calculated. They found themselves insolent toward arithmetic. Joffrey was brought in with a set of protests he could have used for any event. He looked at Dany with a contempt he had nowhere near earned. "You are a child," she supplied. He flushed as if she had stolen more than his word. The dragons cocked their heads in eerie unison until he looked away because only tyrants can sustain that sort of eye contact. "You sit a chair that cuts," she said. "It is an honest chair for all that. It slices fools and the unwary. It has not cut you enough." Cersei was drawn in by smaller stairs, gravity making an argument in her posture that pride refused to rehearse. Her mouth was bloodless. "You will burn us all," she said, not pleading, merely naming what she had trained herself to see. "I have burned almost no one in Westeros," Daenerys said, "and I have refused to when men begged for the spectacle. You have a gift, Lady Cersei, for believing the worst of others because you have such a tender relationship with your own appetite." They looked at one another and recognized neither mercy nor sisterhood in that moment, only the shape of the other's resolve. Tyrion gestured and men came with documents, which is how coups become histories. "If we are all to live through this," he said mildly, "we might begin to exchange words that are not daggers. Your Grace." He inclined his head to Daenerys with a precision that acknowledged the fact without becoming fond of it. "Shall we begin with a proclamation?" The small folk appreciate proclamations. They give the illusion of symmetry. Her first decree was more simple than anyone had expected and less satisfying to those who thirsted for theater. The city's granaries were to be opened to stave off hunger while the harvest was fetched, which would be bargained for with coin and not taken by force. The price of bread would be fixed for 30 days. A census of orphans would be taken so that a record might exist of how many children the city had lost in the process of teaching itself to live with wars. The second decree was ceremonial and practical both. The faith was asked to bless her reign, as it had blessed usurpers and mad kings alike, with the understanding that blessing implied duties that were not merely postures. The third was as sharp as a blade. Every Lannister man under arms was to surrender his weapons within the city or be treated as an enemy soldier. Every Tyrell soldier within the city would be given the same offer, and the Tyrells were invited to discuss how best they might be of use in repairing what they had helped to break. She did not ask Joffrey to bend the knee. She sent him to Casterly Rock under guard along with his mother and his brother, with the understanding that hostages are a currency and that interest must be paid. Marjorie Tyrell was sent home to Highgarden with words that tasted like honey and warnings that tasted like salt. Tyrion she asked to stay. "You understand places," she said. "I will not ask you to pretend to love me, but you are good at turning rooms so that they do what is wanted of them." "My lady," Tyrion said dryly, "you have taken the city. The rooms have already begun to behave." She sat the Iron Throne at dusk. The light made the metal almost shy. Drogon lay coiled at the foot of the dais like a dropped piece of night. Regal and Viserion took the galleries and preened with a vanity that would be terrifying later and was merely beautiful now. She felt the press of knives through her thin dress and did not flinch, which was the same thing as flinching, if you thought about it long enough. The hall filled with the sound of men and women breathing and of history unfolding like a sheet you try to shake out and find is heavier than you'd thought. The first petitioners were small. A seamstress who wanted to know if her son would be taken for the city watch now that it had changed its colors. A baker who wanted to be sure flour would not be requisitioned by men who used words like necessity as if they forgave all sins. A boy whose father had not come home from the riverside the night the green fire had been, and who wanted to know what the queen intended to do with his father's last fishing net. She gave answers in a voice that had not yet grown accustomed to its own echo and felt the throne point out to her, with tender cruelty, every word that might someday come back. At midnight, when the hall had emptied and the candles guttered the way candles do when the duty they perform has made them suddenly regret being made, she descended and walked the corridors where Targaryens had courted madness and magnificence alike. Barristan moved beside her in silence. "I dreamt of snow," she said. "This city smells of fire." "There will be both," Barristan said. "A rain is the weather. One can predict, but it will do as it likes. She had the table brought from Dragonstone months later and set up in a room that had once been a nursery. The painted table belonged there less than it had belonged anywhere else and more, because it made the room a promise and not a tomb. She ran her fingers over the rivers and mountains, and the dragons climbed up to make of the Stormlands a bed and of the Reach a toy. Ravens traveled. Robb Stark's letter came with the reserve of a boy practicing adulthood and an honesty that rang like iron on a good day. He would be king in the north, he wrote. He did not intend insult. He intended survival. Daenerys stared at the words long enough for the wax to melt in the heat of the room. She thought of Aegon's time and the way words like fealty had meant one thing in one mouth and a different thing in another's. She thought of Dorne and remembered how long men can stay themselves when the rest of the world insists otherwise. She sent her answer with care. Keep your crown. Keep your snows. I ask only that you let me keep my riverlands and my coasts. The Night's Watch is a wall between us that I will not insult by attempting to own. If the dead men your letter nearly spoke of come down in the winter you promise me is no mere story, send to me. I have fire. I am not ashamed to put it to use where it belongs. In the months that followed, she learned the work that was not a story. She learned that a city's drains are a better barometer of peace than its parades. She learned that the small council is only as useful as the number of men upon it who are willing to say unpleasant truths. She learned that Varys would tell her things she needed to know in such a way that she might forgive him for knowing them. She learned that Tyrion, whether drunk or irritable, would always find the crack in a lie, even when the lie came dressed as generosity. She learned that the dragons would not obey hunger that was not truly theirs. She learned that dreams of white presaged letters from the wall far more often than coincidence could explain. Winter began to assemble itself with the earnestness of a poor man building a house. Dany walked the ramparts on mornings that cut the lungs and watched her dragon's breath plume like banners. She held court for men whose lips turned blue and for women who broke their sentences to cough in a way that made sheaves of parchment look like excuses for not doing what should be done. She signed her name under decrees and under mercies and under death sentences she could not avoid if she was to keep everything else from becoming death sentences for everyone. Some nights she woke with the taste of ash in her mouth and the sound of her brother's voice in the next room, though he was nowhere any longer that she could argue with him. Some afternoons she stood at the painted table and traced with a fingertip from Sunspear to Winterfell and felt her people move as if under her skin. She remembered a night of cinders and the smell of burned horsehair and the absence that leaves more space behind it than it could have ever occupied. She remembered that she was mother of dragons and queen of a city that had forgotten how to be ashamed. Once, after a morning crowded with arguments about grain and a noon crowded with arguments about ships, she climbed the long narrow stair to the Tower of the Hand where the light, when it came sideways. Tyrion sat at a window with a goblet that had more dignity than its use, scowling at a page that had long ago stopped deserving such attention. "Tell me what I do not see," she said. He did not look up for a moment, which was his way of being respectful when his respect was reluctant. "You do not see how much men love the idea of you," he said finally, extending the page like a dead bird held up for identification. "It is useful. It is also treacherous. For some it will stand in for the reality, and when the reality behaves like a person and not like an idea, they will assume betrayal. Also, the drains beneath flee bottom clog at every rain. It will make a plague of rats if you do not fix it. Rat plagues are not good for queens." "Thank you," she said, "for the drains most of all." "Queens must be grateful for drains," he agreed, "and for honest enemies. Have I some? Some. Fewer than yesterday. More than tomorrow if you go on like this." "Like what?" "Like a queen," he said and took a drink. The first report from the wall that spoke plainly of something no history would be comfortable having had been written came as Snow was learning again how to be more than an anecdote. Men dead with eyes that were not eyes. Horses scattered. A cold that did not feel like weather but like intention. The signature read simply Jon Snow, which made her mouth curve for reasons she could not have explained concisely. She sent a letter back with promptness and with supplies and with the promise of fire. "I am a queen that means to keep her realm alive," she wrote. She sealed it with wax impressed by a dragon whose shape had not been imagined for 100 years. When spring came into the air like a rumor of generosity, she stood on a balcony of the red, keep in a dress the color of new iron, and watched the city move. People laughed with their heads thrown back and did not flinch when shadow crossed them because her dragons were now a kind of shadow among others. In the distance, the bell towers that had once rung for panic were quiet. She listened further for the sound beyond the sound. The noise empires make at peace, and found only the heartbeat of a woman who had come across a great many distances to learn how to sit still and do it well. Drogon beat his wings once and settled his head on the balustrade beside her hand. The heat of him warmed her wrist. She looked west, as Kaith had told her to long ago, and then north, and then down to the narrow street where a child drew the shape of a dragon with a stick in dust and made a small sound of satisfaction. The road she had taken shone behind her, not with the shine of faultless planning, but with the ordinary radiant wear of being used. The scuff of feet, the lines of wheels, the stains of rain, real roads, the kind that matter, the kind no map can perfectly keep. She remembered the pyre, and the bees of cinder coming up into dawn, and the moment the world had chosen to be strange enough to contain her. She closed her eyes and saw the painted tables, coasts, and rivers as if they lived behind her lids. She opened them and watched the sun strike copper on the domes of Baylor September and turn the river past the city to a blade newly cleaned. The wind lifted and carried the smell of the sea up to her. She had come to the sea and then across it. She had wanted salt on her lips and had found it and more. She had not burned everyone who deserved to be burned. That was wisdom. She had not forgiven everyone it would have been fashionable to forgive. That was justice. Summer would be brief. Winter would not be mild. Men would declare themselves and would be wrong as often as they were right. The world would insist on being what it was, a place where love came dressed as treachery, and treachery as love, and the simplest requests, bread, safety, the right to stand in sun with your eyes closed, proved the most difficult tasks for kings and queens alike. She set her hand on Drogon's neck and felt the thrum under her palm, that small, deep engine of fire making its private explanations to itself. The city breathed. The river made small conspiracies with the light. The world did not end. It went on, and she went on in it, a girl who had walked out of fire with 3 impossibilities and had made of each not a weapon but a future.